At Simio, we're in the business of showing you the future. Our intelligent technology gives you unprecedented insight into complex systems to identify and solve today's inefficiencies and tomorrow's challenges. The Simio solution provides a low-risk opportunity to drive transformational change. Our true digital twin models capture all the constraints, business rules, and decision logic that define the operation of your system. When powered by your data, easily evaluate unlimited scenarios and deliver optimized solutions. No matter what industry you're in, eliminate your greatest operational process and scheduling challenges with a Simio digital twin. See your future success, Simio.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the Simio Solution Series. Today's session is Model Scoping Best Practices. There will be a few things I alert you on today during today's intro here from my perspective. First thing is, if you have not attended prior Simio webcasts, this session is piggybacks upon the last session we did on June the 9th, where it was selecting modeling techniques for varying project objectives. That was almost like the first movie, and now we're in the prequel today as far as model scoping best practices. I am Dan Vasilini, the VP of Global Sales here at Simio. Doing most of the presenting is going to be Ryan Luttrell. One thing you will see as I'm going through the presentation here in the next couple slides is that QR code, and it's going to be all around. I've got it in the top left corner, I've got it in the top right corner, I've got it in the bottom. If you could at some point during the presentation today or when we're done, I'll flash this one last time. That's just a quick survey. We're trying to get feedback from everyone on kind of what we're doing with our solution series and what people like about it, what they don't like about it. And one thing you'll see on my next or 2 slides from now is some feedback we've gotten on our sessions up to this point. So before we get started, a couple housekeeping items. Please be aware that everyone, or today's session is being recorded for replay purposes. If you would like to watch this session, refer it to a colleague, or rewatch the session, refer it to a colleague, refer it to a friend. It will be on the Simio webpage. Usually we have it up in about 12 to 24 hours. So by Monday, it's usually up on our website for to watch it again. You are in mute during today's session. You will be on mute during the entire session. If you do have a question during the presentation today, somewhere on your screen you should have a GoToWebinar box, and in that box there should be a question arrow where you can drop it down and type your question in there. So if you do have a question during today's presentation, please find that box, find the question box, type your question in, and I generally try to interrupt the presentation or interrupt when the questions do come in, because they're usually relevant to the point of presentation we're at. But if the question is more generic in nature and it can be addressed at the end, I will address it at the end, or we'll try to get it addressed at the end. Today's session usually, or our sessions usually last anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. I think today's session Ryan has planned for about 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes. Obviously with questions that can extend upon as long as you'd like. All right, so as I mentioned, from an update perspective, so we did get some feedback. We are going to skip next month, the month of August. We are not going to do a solution series session next month. So if you watched one of our previous sessions, or if you are, coming on this thinking, oh, this happens the second Friday of every month, yes, it usually does, but we are not going to do one in August because of vacations. We had some people say that they would not be able to attend August, so we're skipping August. And more importantly, we are going to shift our session in September to a Wednesday. So it's going to be Wednesday, September the 13th. It seems like Friday is a good day for some people, but some others, it's not the greatest day. We've done these sessions in the past on Thursdays and Fridays, so we're going to try a session here on Wednesday to see if that is if it's better for people to attend live. Obviously, from our standpoint, we'd love for you to attend live. We have no problem you watching the recording, but we'd love for you to attend live because that's when questions can come in. It's usually much more interactive and lively when there are, when there's a large crowd to ask a bunch of questions versus a smaller crowd, and then the questions come in usually afterwards on email. So we have no problem with questions coming on email, but it's nice to have the questions come in live and then everyone can hear them. So yeah, just to recap, next session, 2 months from now, almost 2 months to the date, Wednesday, September the 13th, and it will be enhancing models with animation, a pretty popular topic. So I would expect, based upon what we've heard, based upon it being on a Wednesday, that might be a pretty well-attended session. So please feel free to sign up now or sign up as it gets closer. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use that session in September as our test bed for our October session. So you'll see, if you watch the prior session, my bullet or my highlight at the bottom usually said look for 1 solution series per month, the second Friday of each month, but now I'm saying the second week of each month. So we're going to try to hold them in the second week, and depending on how the live attendance goes on Wednesday and what the feedback we get from that is, we might stick with Wednesdays or we might switch to Tuesdays. We'll see. But for now, we're going to just say the second week of the month. All right. And then there's my QR code there again, popping up in the top right. So if you don't mind filling out that survey at some point during today's session, that would be great. And then my last slide is the thank you slide. I'll bring this slide up at the end so that everyone can see that QR code one last time to get some feedback for us. So that's it for me. Ryan, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you, and the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Dan. Just double checking you can see my presentation okay?
Yep, looks good.
Great, thank you. I'll turn my video on just to say hi to everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan. As Dan mentioned in the intro, I'm a solutions engineer here at Simio. And today I'm going to be talking about the ever so popular topic of model scoping and some best practices around doing that. I don't have a model for us to see today, and I don't have the nice animation that Adam is going to have in the next presentation. So I'm going to try to keep this as live as possible with the presentation itself. So Dan, interrupt me throughout the way with the questions as they come in so we can keep this as engaging as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn my video off, and we'll get into the presentation here. So first, a little bit about what are we going to talk about today. So here's our agenda, but really what I plan to have be talked about today, and what I really hope you all leave with, is some best practices when scoping a simulation project. I hope everyone in the attendance is familiar with simulation projects and has either gone through a scoping effort in the past, or maybe is currently trying to go through one, and looking for some tips and best practices to take away and apply to either the next time you're going to do this or to your current effort. So there's a lot that goes into scoping. So we're going to really just start off with setting some understanding about what is scoping and why should we do it. So first, we really feel like as modeling engineers, I think we hear this a lot, right? This is our goals and requests from our stakeholders, right? So they come to us and they are looking for these types of initiatives to either improve their processes, reduce waste, maybe eliminate some inefficiencies, or just increase throughput. I mean, we hear that all the time, right? And all of these you may have different competing priorities from your different stakeholders that fall into these different categories, right? And maybe you have new priorities that come up, midway through the presentation or through the project, and how do you get that priority into the project or have that conversation with that stakeholder about where that priority lies within the project. So, for me, this is really the somewhat of the noise that we hear when we're a modeler, and we're trying to figure out where do we start with all of this, right? We know a lot of our stakeholders have varying competing objectives. And maybe as a modeler, we have an objective ourselves as well, right? Our local team has some specific things that we're trying to test and discover ourselves. So really, that's what I'm hoping you all can take away with today, is how do we take a lot of this noise and consolidate it into a project plan that is going to work for all of our stakeholders involved. So that's really where we get started. And we'll start, like I said, with defining kind of what and the why is scoping. So, kind of the definition there. I really think it's important to include, boundaries, objectives within the scope. my colleagues will probably know this better than most. I'm kind of a preacher of project objectives in a way. I think that is extremely important to clearly define at the very beginning of any type of project. And that gets really hard. It's easy to say in defining objectives and saying, okay, well, this is what the people want out of the model, right? These are the types of questions I want to answer. But understanding the complexity that goes into being able to answer that question, then building out a project plan to getting to the point of answering that question effectively is really the hard part. And I think that's really what I want you all to take away today. So within scoping, I think those are the 5 big buckets that we're going to talk about today as it relates to scoping. And I really think these are like kind of the 5 expectations, if you will, of scoping as you're going into this effort. So we'll definitely go into each of these, but the big one, again, number 1, clarifying objectives, I think is the most important in the scoping effort. But down to number 5, that could also be even seen as number 1. You'll see a common theme throughout this presentation that communication and collaboration is essential to scoping. So really having that alignment of your stakeholders is another major objective with scoping. So as we start to get into this, when we talk about scoping and we talk about a simulation project, a lot of times some of our stakeholders want to go, all the way, have everything modeled in right away. Some use the term or the analogy of boiling the ocean right out of the gate and trying to get everything into the model right away, right? And we find that that leads to not a very successful project development or a project plan. You're trying to do too much, so you're not really thinking about the steps of how to get to that final step. So this slide is really intended to say, even though if your journey is sending you into a digital twin, right, where you're going to need complex data, you're going to need robust process logic, you're going to have a really complex simulation tool at the end of the project, or at the end of this whole life cycle of the project, then you may still scope individual milestones along the way, and that's the main point here. So don't try to scope the digital twin right out of the gate unless that is your pure objective. But even within scoping a digital twin project, there are steps and milestones along the way that you can break down the project and really help give you some stages to go through, right? So those are extra points to say, hey, have we gotten everything right up until this point? Have your stakeholders align on the fact that the model is now at stage 1, maybe where you're just in modeling, and then you move on to stage 2 and you start to do analyzing together as your project team, and you're bringing your stakeholders along during that journey. That doesn't always work, of course, but we definitely recommend here to make, again, like scope each step of the journey, not the entire journey itself. And it definitely helps keep the scope manageable, right? I think when we talk about a large scope document and trying to build a project plan around every detail that we need to be included into a digital twin, it's hard to consume by all of the stakeholders as well. So if we can break that down into an easy, digestible milestone that people are going to resonate with and understand why we're getting to that step first, is really the goal with model scoping. And you can really start to within a single scoping effort, break down the milestones and scope in detail each of them if you're ready to do that. But I always find that there are things that I learned in the first milestone that are going to apply to the second milestone, and make it easier or change the direction of how we would go in the second milestone. So yeah, again, just stay focused on getting that first step done and accomplished, and then but still having the vision for where you want to take the model into the future to leave it open for that. So there may be particular techniques that you use when building the model to allow for it to scale to a digital twin, but not necessarily building in all the functionality required or scoping that functionality required out of the gate. So that's just the sentiment there. And this next slide really takes that to the data level. So a lot of times when we're trying to move from step to step here, the data that we have available to feed into the model or to use to define the model behavior is really sometimes the constraint. When we're going from 1 to 2 and then really from 3 to 4 is really the data requirement to do so. And so a lot of times, the data that you have available to you will somewhat dictate your scope, right? And that's why it's so critical to have deep data conversations at the beginning of the scoping effort, and really understand like these three things that are here. Because from my experience with getting into projects, large complex data can be the place where the estimate for time is generally always off. It seems to always take longer when you're dealing with complex data than it seems it's going to take. And of course, that ranges from project to project, but I've found that really it comes down to some of these three pieces here that dictate, what really consumes the most time when considering data in a large project. And that first one is really just having an understanding of what data you have available. If you're a large if you're a large enterprise, manufacturer, let's say, or just a really large corporate company that has been around for a long time and has enterprise data systems in place already that have been collecting historical records for longer than you have been at that company, right? It is sometimes hard to understand everything that is currently available and really what all of that data is telling you. And if you don't have we would say like a data representative on your project team, that can even, you have to almost build in extra time for yourself as the modeler to get your hands around what data is available and how can I use it. And there's other questions too, is like how reliable is the data and how well is it maintained? So it's in a good state now, but it's just that the processes and around how that data is being used, it might not be useful for the model in the future. Or if the source isn't reliable, it may not be a good option for building into maybe an operational model tool, but maybe something more for like a one-time analysis. So yeah, the amount of data that you have available to you really can dictate the amount of scope that the amount of capability that the model can have, but as well as how much time you need to really account for bringing the data in, getting the data ready and bringing it into the model. And getting the data ready is really kind of the second piece here, which is the data cleansing. So no matter really what data system you're dealing with, there are going to be records that are in that data set that you don't want for your simulation model, or the data tables are not quite in the right format for the simulation model. So you have to do some transforms to produce the data views that you ideally would have feed into the simulation model. So that's the piece here, is this data cleansing piece, is really making sure that once you have an understanding of all the data that is out there and available for you to use, what is the effort required to get that data into a usable format for Simio? And sometimes there's more effort put into data cleansing to make it easier on the modeling side, and sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes we deal with the way the data is formatted and the current structure, and we model around it. It just kind of depends on what's possible on the data pre-processing side. But I always lean towards, especially if the capability is there in your project team, is having that data cleansing done ahead of Simio, and having the data table format appropriate for Simio to take it in and run with it right away. And sometimes when we talk about getting those data views ready for Simio right away, it's connecting data from multiple sources. And really the first step for doing something like that is having a common place for that data to reside after it comes together. So a lot of our projects involve a database that Simio model is going to use itself, like an intermediate database between all of the enterprise databases that is just intended to pull data in, reformat it for the simulation model, and then be available for Simio to import whenever there's going to be a simulation run completed. So that's kind of the first step, is really finding the location where you want all of this data to come together to, and then creating the ability to actually connect them. So if you're talking about maybe SKU level data or personnel level data, across databases, there may be different identifiers for the same SKU or the same person, and that can be really tricky to resolve, to be honest with you. So that piece is critical, in connecting your databases is kind of like what I like to call, like, make sure they're all speaking the same language, and from there you can connect them in and produce the views that are needed for the simulation model. And so when you talk about scoping the data that's required and estimating the effort to get that data ready for the simulation model, it's really important to consider these three pieces. And it's important to understand when the complexity of the model that you're trying to produce, how much data is truly required to support that level of complexity. So on my graph over here on the left-hand side, you can see inside the arrow, there are different types of projects that are going up the arrow. And really, those types of projects are enabled by the data that you see in the axes. So based on your data speed and the detail of your data would enable these different types of projects to be completed. So again, it's important to understand what's the goal of the ultimate objective of your simulation project. And do I have the data to support that objective, or do we need to scale back the model fidelity in order to achieve based on what we have available today, and then put a separate project plan, a data project plan in place for getting that data available for Simio, so that we can increase our simulation capability and get to that level that we're looking for. So that is the main takeaway here with data. Again, it's just like with that last bullet I have, data integrity and the level of data really are key considerations for with the model scoping, and the correlation between the systems as well. So next, I mentioned project complexity, and considering project complexity in the last slide. Really want to start to define, what I really mean by project complexity. There's a lot of different definitions, and I think it tends to be industry specific, on what makes up a complex model. But a complex model, a simulation model, could really include any or all of these items that we have on the slide here. So when we think about multiple interacting components, it's kind of like, if you think about it from a manufacturing example, maybe it's multiple tiers of production, right? So you have your finished good, and then maybe some intermediate goods that you're producing to finish those goods. But then there's also maybe raw material preparation that's required for your intermediate, and all of that has to be modeled and in sync to then produce the finished goods. So that can be somewhat of a complex scenario to model, just because of all the different tiers that you have. Maybe then you have personnel or operators that are working in multiple tiers as well. You have equipment resources that are needed for all three tiers, and maybe some of them are shared, right? And so that the multiple interacting components is where you start to get into some complex modeling. And also that it built into those interacting components can be the behavior of those components as well. So, in the behavior, I really start to think of it as really complex constraints. And if your constraints are fairly straightforward, right, and easy to describe, and almost like a bullet point outline, then it's fairly easy for us to model, right? But if you have a very conditional constraint that is considering several different parameters at a single time, and or it maybe has to be triggered at a very specific situation, that's where the model complexity can start to increase. And of course, the data that we talked about before, if the amount of data that's required for the model is highly dimensional, then you're definitely going to have a more complex model project at the end of it. And then, variability is always something that's hard to model and harder to validate. So ensuring that you have the right level of variability and uncertainty built into your model can be a complex situation, especially if there's a lot of variability of dependent processes, where you're going to basically see that variability have effect downstream to your processes as well. So that again just adds to the potential project complexity of your simulation project. And this last one really speaks to maybe the diversity of your project team, right? And the requirement there. So if there are just different disciplines that are required to just build the understanding of what's required to go into the simulation model, whether it's its decision framework or whether it's the input data that's coming into it, or maybe it's modeling a specific environment that only that stakeholder really knows well from their previous expertise. That can be complex, right? If you as the modeler don't really have the full I guess experience in all the disciplines required for whatever the project is, then you're going to have to lean on your stakeholders more for that information and for that direction. So they can definitely add some complexity to the project. But again, all of this, these are all pieces to take into account when scoping the project, right? To identify how complex is it and how much time should I start to give individual items in my project plan. So hopefully that makes sense there. And then once you've really identified the complexity of the project that's required, it's then starting to understand what type of simulation is required to fit the project objective, right? There are several broader types of simulations out there, and a lot of them can be done within Simio. The discrete event simulation is our most common type of simulation done within Simio. And then within that type of simulation, we have what I would say maybe more focused areas inside discrete event simulation. And a lot of these focused areas really do depend on the project objectives. And some of your projects could include all of these areas. And some of them may be just a subset, or maybe at the beginning you start with one area and you're growing to the next two. But we really find that, like if you identify through your project objectives that seeing the flow of your materials through the facility, the flow of your operators, maybe you're evaluating some buffer points and how much space you would have on the floor for a layout. That's really where we see an animation-focused model supporting that initiative. And then, taking it to another step where you want to maybe do analysis of the design of that system. So should I consider purchasing more equipment? Should I hire more personnel? Should I maybe change a process, change the route of a particular product to go to a different part of my facility to remove the bottleneck? All of those what if experimentations is now somewhat of a next focus, and that's where we may have animation built into that experimentation model if it's required for the project scope, but also we may have very limited animation just to validate the results as modelers. And it's really more the experimentation results and maybe the dashboards that are built in for supporting the experimentation results are what the key stakeholders are going to want. So it may not, the animation may not be needed to support that particular use case. And then for the last one with schedule execution, if you're having the Simio model set up as a digital twin and an operational decision maker, then you would not really need animation at all. No one's going to ever see the model. Your planners are going to see the plan that the Simio model produced, but they're not going to actually see the run, right? They just want to see what decisions did the model make and were they appropriate. Okay, if so, let me publish them for my team to follow. So depending on the project objective, really will dictate what type of focus you need to have within your simulation model. And this really ties back to Drew's presentation last month around what type of simulation application to choose for the different project objectives. So definitely check that one out for more detail on this subject. All right, so now we get into somewhat of the meat of the presentation here. As we're actually planning the project, this is the steps or the sequence that I would recommend that everyone take when starting a project planning effort, or what we a project scoping effort like we've been talking about today. And really the first step, like I mentioned earlier, is establishing communication channels. So the communication between your stakeholders is just critical, and has to be clear from the beginning of the project to the very end, and that from a relationship perspective, but also from just the project success perspective, has to be in place, or you're going to have problems down the road. So establishing roles for everyone in the project, I think, is critical, and understanding, like leaning on people's expertise and strengths around those roles is really critical here. And that can be hard because sometimes early on, it's not necessarily clear all of the requirements of the project. Maybe there are things that happen and you discover that you're going to have to add additional functionality. And sometimes that happens, and you build in contingencies for that. But at the beginning, you have an idea of what you are trying to achieve, and it's really critical to identify the required resources to get that done, and then really establish a team of stakeholders that are going to have different roles and responsibilities throughout the project. And then setting up channels to foster that collaboration, right? So if it's regular meetings, or if it's just a team chat window that everyone's giving updates on what they're working on and the progress. It's some type of organized cadence that the whole team has agreed upon around how we're going to give updates, how we're going to keep everyone up to speed on the project progress, and as well, scheduling different points for documentation. So we want to actually document every decision that was agreed upon, right? So that if it ever comes up, and again later down the road, there's probably thousands of decisions that have to be made for the project. Having a space where all of that documentation can be done together and collaboratively, I think is critical. So starting with even just like your statement of work, document, having that shared with all the stakeholders, having them engaged with it, and providing feedback on what should be included there. But then as you go forward, having ways for decisions that were made documented and available for all the stakeholders to go back to as well. So that's really the first piece. I think understanding who's going to be involved and how you all are going to work together is really a critical piece for the project scope. The next piece is really then building out the plan, right? So you've talked to all the stakeholders, and you've gotten all of the different objectives that your different stakeholders have for this particular project. Now you just start to break down those objectives into very specific tasks, right? And putting them, not even putting them in a plan yet, but just saying, in order for me to achieve this objective, I'm going to have to do these 20 things. And understand maybe the sequence that's required for those tasks within that particular objective as well, right? And then you start to put all of that information into a plan once you have estimated times for each of those tasks. And the estimated times can be really tricky, right? Especially if you don't have a lot of experience doing the activity that you're estimating time for. I always err on the side of, it's going to take longer than I think it is. I tend to always underquote time in projects, and then especially around data, like I mentioned earlier. And it tends to take longer than I expect it to. So if there's something you're unsure or uneasy about, maybe ask someone with more expertise in that space on what they feel the appropriate amount of time would be to get that task completed. Or, like I said, err on the side of conservative. Try to be honest about the time, but give yourself some grace to maybe do some discovery in that area. So. Building that timeline is important, right? And so that starts to then define the milestones of when they're going to of things are going to get completed. And from there, once you have all the tasks laid out in a plan, you can start to see what resources you're going to need when for the project. So there may be a time where the lead modeler is the only one involved in the project, right? There will probably be several positions throughout the project plan where that's the only resource required. But at the beginning of the project, you may have a data scientist that is helping out with the input data that's coming into the model, working with the modeler, making sure that they can both together get the views that are needed. As well as maybe you have other operators or subject matter experts that are on the project early on or throughout the project to help consult and provide the modeler with the needed detail that is needed. As well as you start to get into maybe more of the final stages of the product and you're looking down the timeline, maybe there's a secondary engineer involved that you deploy or you delegate different modeling tasks to as the lead modeler. And then you start to understand, okay, well, if I need to schedule these check-ins with maybe my leadership as the stakeholders, then I maybe need to schedule that pretty far out in advance, right? Because we all know their calendars fill up quick. So it would be just having that plan that early to work against and schedule against can really be really helpful when getting the resources you need, aligned to that plan. But also this gives you an opportunity to modify the plan if needed to support the resources you have available, right? So if you have a modeler that you're hoping to have on this project, but they're not going to their workload isn't going to allow them to be on the project for another month, then you could build that into the project plan, right? And maybe there are other activities that you could front load during the month that they're out and try to be ready for them when they come on board. So definitely looking at how you're going to allocate the resources to your project plan is an important step there. And you're constantly monitoring the plan. So if something with your resources change, which they inherently do, it's gonna happen, especially if you're on a long project plan. Then you just have to build a replan, right? Build a new plan around the resources at that time, whenever that event may take place. And that really comes into the risk management piece here too, right? So if resources is one of the risks that you foresee, then maybe even having a backup for a potential for a person on a project is a really good contingency plan to put in place. But really any of the tasks that you have, and you have maybe a time frame that you have estimated, but you're not really feeling super confident about that time frame like we talked about in the past, that could potentially be a risk, right? And having a contingency for that particular task may be helpful, right? So if we say, let's say this one particular task is going to take 3 weeks. Well, if you're 2 weeks in and you realize you're not past the halfway point, or you feel that you're not, then maybe we bring in help, and we've already scheduled help for you on that 3rd week to make sure that we could get that task done, right? Or try to minimize the amount of delay that we're going to experience from that task as much as possible, right? So that's another example of a pretty good contingency plan to put in place with project planning. But really, it's constantly monitoring your project plan and addressing the risk as they come up, because there's, as much as we like to think that we can really foresee any risk that's going to be coming up with the project plan, it's almost impossible to do that. And so as risks become apparent, then it's really best to address them there as a team, right? So that's the important piece for the communication and the collaboration. Everyone has to be involved in making the best decision for how to deal with that risk, or how to mitigate that risk, or how to try to get back on track or back on plan if a risk had become an actual problem, and it's actually now affecting the project plan. How do we get ourselves back on track or replan accordingly? So those are, I think, the 4 critical steps of building a project plan through scoping. And the next slide is really just summarizing. Or sorry, we have one more slide. Like through project scoping, inherently you're going to have tough conversations, and it's always best to have those tough conversations early on rather than down the road. If you try to maybe glaze over a topic, right, and it's like, oh, that seems too big or too cumbersome to figure out right now, it's eventually going to bite you down the road, because it's something that needs to be worked out and agreed upon with all of your stakeholders. And if you start work without agreeing on a direction there, then you may come up into a position where you've modeled in a different direction. Then that issue comes back up, and it's now you've got the model set in a particular approach, and you have to maybe remodel to account for that objective that you were trying to leave for later, if you will. But so that's why we really say having the tough, honest conversations early in scoping is really critical for project success. And it's digging into when people say, this is what I want to do with the model. It's really digging in with further questions and discovery about what that means to that stakeholder. Because and a lot of times our stakeholders aren't as familiar with simulation as we are, right? So we have to somewhat be a translator and an educator in this space for our stakeholders when they're coming to us for this expertise. So just trying to be open and honest with your stakeholders about whenever they ask for something, giving them an honest opinion about the effort involved and what that truly means for the impact on the project, but also having that honest conversation about, well, here are all of our stakeholders' priorities, right? And we're going to look at all of those together and then together prioritize those. That really helps. I think the conversation, and helps if there's one particular stakeholder that is passionate about an objective and feels that it should be the very first thing that's worked on. And maybe everyone agrees that it is an important topic, but it's something too cumbersome for us to tackle right out of the gate. So I think having that group effort of having all the stakeholders involved to agree upon what are the objectives that should be included is really critical, right? Because that's, in my opinion, the best way to manage conflicting expectations. Obviously, if it becomes to a point where you need to escalate because there's just a disagreement with the group, I highly lean in on that. I say escalate early in scoping rather than later. But really, scoping is the start of the project, but it's also the start of this working relationship a lot of times with different stakeholders. So having I guess again a good healthy relationship at the beginning, where we all know that we're trying to achieve the ultimate same objective, and again getting leadership involved when needed to help with maybe that reminder or just the direction in the room to say this is where we're going to go, and doing that, of course, professionally and with respect. And just the last point, that just to tie back to the slide that I had before, really, again, it's critical to document all the decisions that are made by the group, so there is no confusion later down the road about the decision that was made and when, and maybe even a little bit of why. It's always helpful to have some notes there, just in case there is still a difference of opinion around a particular decision. If that ever comes up again down the road, it's great to have that documentation to lean back on and say, here's when and why we decided to go in this direction. So with that, we'll close up here with some key considerations for scoping. And a lot of this is what I have said throughout the presentation, but just really want to reemphasize some critical points here to take away with you when you're trying to go scope your next modeling effort. So identifying the stakeholders is critical, and understanding the stakeholder priorities and objectives, and then prioritizing all of those together is a critical step within scoping. And with the stakeholders, their role, identifying their roles, I think is something that I even should have added to this slide here. Is something that's really important with that piece as well. And even if their role is just a consumer of the results or the final customer, then it's really important to document that out and having that understanding of who the roles and the responsibilities of everyone involved. And then with that, it's really taking all of those objectives that you have from the stakeholders and defining clear, obtainable project objectives that are aligned upon with all of your stakeholders. It's, again, harder than it sounds, especially as the project gets more complex. The objectives range and and sometimes vary, and it's really tough to have those prioritization conversations. But if you have the right group of stakeholders involved, you've got their roles and responsibilities defined. Everyone should be contributing their opinions and their consult to that decision, but there's a decision maker involved that should define the project objectives and align with all of the stakeholders. And then, as we mentioned on the project plan, really assessing resource constraints. When you're looking at trying to meet an objective, you're going to have expertise that are required. And if you don't have that expertise already in-house, is there ways to maybe consult out for that expertise, or look for across your organization for another team that may have the expertise that you're looking for? But this can be a pretty detrimental to a project plan if you haven't assessed that early on. And again, building in different contingency plans for resources as well is critical. And I will just point out here with the resource piece too, and I know I mentioned this in the past, but you're going to have resources that come and go out of a project, and you could also have stakeholders that come and go as well. And it can be tough to have that conversation with a new stakeholder that's coming in and has new objectives mid-project. And that's always why the documentation is really critical, to lean back on. Here's all the previous decisions we made and why. But also, when you define the project boundaries in this last point, if a new stakeholder does come in, it can be easier if you already have those boundaries in place to say that is a great idea, and you're right, that objective is important. But for right now, for this particular project, that is outside of scope or outside the bounds of what we're going to be working on. So having that really clearly communicated at the beginning and defined at the beginning and aligned on at the beginning with everyone involved, it is critical. But with the boundaries, you also don't want to cut yourself off for future growth with that project. So it's really important to consider how you're going to still scale and maintain flexibility with the model or with the project in general. So kind of going back to that whole digital continuum slide of getting through all the 6 stages, you really want to make sure that if your goal is to get to 6, you want to set up your modeling approaches to align with that, even in 1, 2, and 3. But you're probably, again, not going to build out the entire model for your stage 6 until you're really ready to get to that point. So yeah, just the closing point here, I guess, is don't let your project boundaries bound the future growth of the model. So perfect. This is what I again, my top considerations for scoping. Communication is required for all of this, and I really hope you all had some takeaways here that you can take with you for your next modeling scoping effort.
So perfect, Ryan. Thank you. That was definitely a mouthful from you. So several questions popped in throughout here. So we have about 11 minutes left in the session. We'll try to get through as many of these questions as we can. First question, are there limits within Simio regards to the amount of data that can be imported or stored?
No. Give it a quick answer to that one.
that was a simple one. All right. Here's a little more of a long question. I'm going to try to read it in parts. How would a modeler begin a Simio model when they know what data they need but don't have it yet? That is, what if, for example, they want to model order fulfillment and want to run historical orders in the model but don't have access to the information just yet? Should they wait for modeling until that data is available, or use other methods until the data becomes available?
Excellent question. Yeah, I would say my go-to for that is if you understand what the schema of the data is going to look like, then what I will typically do is build a table, maybe in Excel, right, that has a kind of a dummy table, as I like to call it, of the same type of information organized in the same way. that your actual data is going to look like, then you can start to model around the data schema, right? And you can start to then even just validating your model results with your dummy data if you're just feeding in, like, pretty common orders, fulfillment orders that you personally know would be coming through the system, and making sure that your system models fulfilling those orders appropriately.
Okay, so you can't say to your boss, I don't have the data, so I can't do work until I get it, is what you're saying.
Well, I mean, I can't give you the exact answer you're looking for, but I could try to, in the effort of trying not to waste time, right? If you're waiting for data, if you do know what that is going to look like, you can save yourself some time and get some modeling done while you're waiting for the actual data.
Got it. Okay. All right. All right. Then I think this is more of an opinion question here. When thinking about a time frame, how long do you think the project planning and scoping takes before modeling can actually begin?
Ooh, good question, and it's kind of one of those. It depends, which I hate to give, but I'll give some examples. If you have a model that's isolated to answering a very specific question, right? And everyone in the room knows, hey, we just need to answer this one question, and we know we have this data here available to answer that one question. That scoping effort could be very fast, right? It could be sometimes in a single meeting that it's completed, or maybe a couple of meetings with broader, written scope and alignment on what was written. But yeah, it could be very, very fast. But on the other side of that, if you have a really complex, like, let's just go with a digital twin project that is expected to schedule, orders and personnel activity for a large manufacturing site. The scope of that particular project may take several weeks to really flesh out, and it may depend on getting the right stakeholders even in the room, from scheduling conflicts to getting the people in the room to agree upon what should be included, but as well as just having an understanding of, or gathering the understanding of what personnel is required, gathering understanding of what data is available today to start to build in how complex that effort is going to be. So there's a lot of initial research, I would say, that's done within scoping that can take up a lot of time if it's a complex model. But I always say, would say a few weeks would be probably the high end on that side.
Okay. All right. A couple more questions here as we're running low on time. What strategies would you suggest for documenting model progression and changes? Would you document in Simio or externally? What would you think there?
Great question. Yeah, I lean to both. And it's a very intentional documentation for the audience. So I always do in-model documentation for other modelers, right? So if I am not the only one working on the project, or if there is any chance that someone else could be working on this model in the future, I want to ensure whenever they open the model, right, that they could get a sense of what's going on without having someone directly explain it to them. So using really good naming conventions, using the description boxes that we have for all the properties, states, and all of our process steps and the processes themselves or the objects. And then, even to the point within process logic, I use color coding to match up maybe the description of my process with a set of colors of the steps and how it relates to that particular description. But that's all within model documentation, right? And that, again, the audience of that is another modeler. For modeling the project progression or the actual contents of the model logic for other stakeholders that are not modelers, generally that includes a flow chart of the decision criteria that is built in, or the logic of the simulation model. And that's more of, again, something that is more digestible by that audience. And you can get pretty in depth with a flow chart and modeling out all or representing all of the detail that is in the simulation model if needed. But then having, there's always a good maybe like a project plan that you're using with all of your stakeholders, and however that might be visualized. Maybe sometimes it's just, an Excel sheet with the task items in each row, and giving the stakeholders an update on each of those items in that format of how you've progressed in that particular category. And maybe there's some notes that are relevant, or notes and or questions that are relevant for the other stakeholders that you put in that document as well. But I think those are the three avenues that I really lean in on documentation. And then there's also kind of like your model spec, or the functional spec of the model itself, that could be used for documentation as well. I also say, like, having your meeting notes in a public place, either it's a public folder, maybe it's like a shared OneNote workbook or notebook that you all are working off of. But when we talk about like documenting the decisions that are made about the project scope, or maybe just the regular meeting notes, if you will, of just like what was discussed in our meetings, it's always important to have those documented in project notes as well.
Okay. All right, let's try to get to two more questions here. Is it important to stage and divide the project into different phases, in your opinion?
100%. Yeah. It kind of mentioned what I mentioned in that the digital continuum slide. It really is important to scope each step of the process and not the entire journey. And giving yourself a milestone to go after and a date, I find it is really not even just good for alignment across your stakeholders, but really motivating too, right? Like, we all work better sometimes when we have a due date. And I think if you can come up with a tangible objective to achieve a shorter period of time, then you start to get your stakeholders bought into the project. You start to get your feet on the ground, right? Like, you start to get some momentum and see, okay, this is actually, we're going in the direction we need to. And then having those validation checks with everybody along the way. So those milestones definitely help with all of that. I highly recommend breaking it down into as many milestones as makes sense. You don't want to have one project with 1,000 milestones, and each milestone is a very specific task. But having it broken up into maybe like a 3, 4, 5 milestone project, somewhere in that scale, I find always works really well.
Okay. All right, let's sorry if we didn't get all the questions that were in here. Let's do one more. I know we're going to leave a couple off the board. So slide on the screen right now is the QR code. If you can give us some feedback on today's webcast, that would be awesome. I will flash our email addresses here one more time. So if we did not get to answer your question, there is both my email address and Ryan's, as well as the QR code in the top left-hand corner. So last question, Ryan. How would you suggest users manage modeling direction changes when the modeling process is started? And, oh boy, my question just went away. I was in the middle of reading it. Oh, there we go. How would you suggest users manage modeling direction changes when the modeling process is started and maybe the goals/objectives have actually changed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's tough. There's not like a silver bullet, I would say, in this space. So if all of the stakeholders agree that the direction needs to change, then it may be a replanning of the project, right? If it's more of a new stakeholder has come in, or the broader organization has a new initiative, then it is like almost somewhat of a leadership conversation and discussion around how much should we change course. I think some of that can be depending on how much has been completed already and how much is still left to be completed. So I think of course, it's one of those answers that it depends, but I think trying to stay true to your plan as much as possible, right? With as much autonomy as you have with that decision, trying to stay true to, hey, this is the project plan we put in place. Here's the balance we put around that project. And is it still appropriate for us to achieve this milestone, or should we change direction? I think it's that tough conversation that we'd have to have at that point. Yeah.
Okay. All right, perfect. I know we're at the top of the hour. I know we have a question or two that we didn't get addressed. So like I said, if your question did not get addressed, I apologize. We just ran out of time. But if you want to reach directly out to myself or Ryan, please do so. As I mentioned early on, this presentation has been recorded. It'll be up on the website here within the next day or so. So if you want to go back and watch anything from today or you missed something from today, great presentation, Ryan. Thanks everyone for attending. Just a quick reminder, the next one 2 months from now on Wednesday, September 13th. So Wednesday, the 13th of September, we will see everyone then. Thanks again for your time, and we'll see you then. Goodbye.